Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Greece Land of Diversity, Forests in Greece, Evolution and Present Condition, presented by Nikos Petrou from the Hellenic Society for the Protection of Nature. My name is Natalie Ivadidis-Tsoukas. I am the chair of THI Canada New Leaders. The New Leaders are a group of young professionals passionate about working together, Oli Mazi, to fundraise and share their skills and expertise in helping to build a better future for Greece. The New Leaders are excited to continue the mission to generate awareness and appreciation for Greece's natural beauty and biodiversity. Today's presentation is the second installment in the digital speaker series with HSPN, and we are grateful for the collaboration between the New Leaders and HSPN, which began earlier this year. We are pleased to announce that the mentorship program with HSPN is underway, with the student exploring the topic of offshore drilling in the Mediterranean. We encourage you all to consider participating. The mentorship aims to promote projects between Canadian and Greek professionals and academics, which will focus on nature conservation and sustainability in Greece. We are very pleased to be joined by Nikos Petrou from HSPN, well-known naturalist, photographer, and author. Hi.
It's good to be with
Nikos.
you.
The Hellenic Society for the Protection of Nature is a well-known Greek NGO founded in 1951. Since its inception, it has actively pursued goals in the areas of nature conservation and restoration, sustainable management, raising of public awareness, and safeguarding environmental laws. It has been instrumental in the development of national parks and other protected areas in Greece. Following Nikos' presentation, there will be a question time, so please feel free to submit any questions you may have during the webinar through the chat function. A link to the recorded presentation will be sent to you tomorrow to share with your colleagues and friends. So let's learn about forests in Greece. Nikos, over to you.
Thank you, Natalie, and thanks to THI Canada for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here again with you, and we're very happy that our collaboration is moving ahead and with the mentorship program, so things are beginning to happen. So if you will allow me to share my screen, we can move directly to our presentation. And our subject today is forests in Greece, their evolution and current status. Let's first look at the factors that have led to the present condition of Greek forests. First of all is the geographic position of Greece in the Mediterranean biogeographical zone, which is one of the hotspots of biodiversity on the planet, with some of 10% of the planet's total plants, about 30,000 different species, in 1.6 of its surface area, of which about 35% are endemic. And there are two centers of endemism, one in the Western Mediterranean and the one in the Eastern, where Greece lies. Also, Greece is at the crossroads of the Central European, the Saharan, and what is called the Irano-Caspian floristic region. So it has plants from all these three areas. Another factor is the diversity and fragmentation of the landscape of the terrain. As you see here in the foothills of Mount Grammos, you can see how variable and how many niches are created. Equally variable is the climate, starting from Mediterranean with a dry, long summer and mild, wet winter, mostly on the low-lying areas, the coast and the islands, and then moving in, towards the mainland and higher altitudes to continental with a wet summer and cold winter, including long periods of snow. But we also have to look at the historic developments going back in time, I guess back to the glacial ages and the last glaciation, which ended about 12,000 years ago, the Wurm-Weissel period as it was known. At that time, this was the extent of ice cover over Europe. You can see that Southern Europe, including Greece, was not frozen. However, the permafrost, permanently frozen ground, extended much further south, and the tree line, the northernmost limit of trees at that time, was sort of at the northern border of Greece. So one important aspect is that Greece did not freeze, and that it supported trees at that time. And just for a comparison, this is where the northernmost limit of trees is today. Now, what happened is as the glaciers started retreating and moving northwards, the vegetation followed them. And what we see here is a spread of oaks, Velanidies, northwards after the end of the last glaciation period. And the contour lines are taken from pollen measurements, and the density of the colors shows the amount of coverage. So you see that 2,000 years later, there was already dense forests of oaks covering most of the southern countries, what is today Spain, Italy, and Greece. And then gradually the forests start moving northwards. But what is important to keep in mind is that this is not an even progress. You can see that it changes, the cover changes according to climatic changes during those times. The geographical barriers in Europe played also an important role, as did what we call the refugia, which are areas that have a stable climate. You can see that they're spread all over the Mediterranean basin, and they have provided shelter for those species during the maximum extent of ice, both during the Pleistocene, that's the last 2 million years before present, but going as far back as to the Tertiary, which is 65 million years before present, and there are some relic plants from that period still surviving. And these were key areas to maintain both species and genetic diversity for plants, globally and regionally, of course, and then allowing them to migrate when the climatic changes conditions improved. These areas, the refugia, were mostly sheltered ravines, as we see here in the gorge of Ramnobor in West Macedonia. And there are some species present there, which do not occur elsewhere. Some of them, like the Haberlea and Ramonda, they're members of the Gesneriad family, and their closest relatives are the wild violets of Africa, which points to a common ancestor of those plants before the continent started moving apart. So we have quite a few plants in Greece dating so far back in time. The geographic barriers in Europe limited the northwards migration of plants. So the forests of Central and Northern Europe are mostly constituted of temperate species, with few thermophilous species of the more warmer areas in the south. In contrast, the southern forests were much less or not at all affected by glaciation, and include the warm-loving species like the Greek juniper that we see here. They're much richer and much older than those of Northern and Central Europe, even hosting, as I said, species going back 65 million years, such as the Oriental sweet gum, which is present in a very small area in Western Asia Minor and only in Rhodes in Greece, in the Valley of the Butterflies, Kyllada με τις πεταλούδες, for those of you that have been there. And the southern forests host approximately 2/3 of all the European forest species, and this is the horse chestnut, Hypocastagna, another relict of the Tertiary, which is Balkan endemic, present in a small area in northwestern Greece. And for some of the species that you will see, I've added the Greek names. Some of you will be familiar with them. For others, I have left the Latin names, the scientific names, because in many cases there are no common names for those plants. So just to give you a better information. Another thing that definitely shaped the present day condition of forests is a human presence and human activities throughout the long history of presence of men and people in Greece. Forests were destroyed or cut down for firewood, for construction materials, for building ships in antiquity. And in many cases, people have replaced the natural forests with man-made forests, such as the extensive olive groves that can be found in many parts of the country, especially in the southern parts. This was the effect of man was particularly devastating in riparian forests, especially in let's say the latter half of the 20th century. This is the fabled Kojaorman, the riparian forest at the Nessos Delta, which around 1920 extended over 12,000 hectares. By the 70s and early 80s, it was reduced down to 800 hectares, of which only 150 were natural forests. And HSPN has been active in that area, participating in a project to reforest and recreate parts of the lost now ancient forest. Sometimes human activities had also a beneficial effect. For example, the border areas during the Cold War were restricted, so you needed permits from the military authorities to get there. So there was much less human activity, and some of the most productive forests still survive and productive, I mean, in terms of biodiversity and natural productivity, still survive in those areas with little impact. What you see here is Chakalos Peak in the Greek-Bulgarian border. That little building in the center of the picture is an old military outpost in that area. And the same applies for the border with Albania. This is in the Prespa region, which harbors the largest forests of Greek juniper that you see here. What we have seen from the 20th century onwards was afforestation, growth of forests taking over the land. This was mainly due to abandonment of settlements. So you have to keep in mind that in the 20th century, Greece went through the Balkan Wars, World War I, then the exchange of populations with Turkey, World War II, the Civil War, and then the massive migration towards urban centers in the 60s and early 70s. So quite a few areas in the countryside were depopulated and abandoned. And much as you will doubt it, this up until the mid-1940s was a village. The village of Krusovo in the Rhodope Mountains. Now all you can see in the dense forest are the cherry trees, and this is an autumn picture, so it's a red color, distinguishing them in the forest. And if you walk in there, of course, you see ruins from the houses, but this was an active village at that time. Another cause was the abandonment of traditional practices and mostly the nomadic pastoralism. Transhuman shepherds like the Sarakatsani used to go up to the mountain pastures in late spring, and then they would move down to the lowlands as winter set in the late autumn. And at that time, they would set fires that would burn the new growth and the shrubs, and so would ensure that next year they would find palatable grasses for their flocks. And actually, there's quite an amusing story. I have a friend who's a Sarakatsanos, and his mother was born in this area, which is named Kalivia Pistola, which means the hats of the Pistolas family, because they traditionally went there. So when the old lady heard that I was going to visit the place with her son, she told us, oh, you know, you go find the place where I was born. It's very easy to see. You go to that hilltop, and there's a solitary tree there, and this is where we build our huts. And this is what the hillsides look today, because grazing has been forbidden here because of initially the Cold War and then the abandonment of movement of the shepherds. So where is the solitary tree? And this is what happens when grazing stops. First of all, we have expansion of the low spiny shrubs, the dwarf juniper that you see here in the foreground. And this provides ideal conditions for growth of the fir seeds. So the seedlings essentially come up from within the juniper clumps, where they find protection from grazing and also ideal conditions and protection, nice temperatures, humidity. And this is the way the forest expands. You see that most of the new fir trees come from within the juniper areas. And this was a target of another of HSPN's projects in that area, where we were trying to find ways, natural-based solutions to control the spread of the forest by using controlled grazing or even controlled burning of those areas. Just a brief talk about what's happening in Europe. Forests cover about 42% of the total surface area. In Greece, the number is slightly less, as you will see. But the main thing is that of those forests, only 2% are really undisturbed forests. And then another 9% is plantations, and almost 90% is semi-natural managed forests. So we've lost almost all of our old age natural forests. In Greece, coverage is 31%, slightly less than the average in Europe, but it has gone up since the 80s and 90s. Unfortunately, the undisturbed areas are probably closer to 0.1%. Just a couple of areas in the Partheno Dasos, in the Fracto, and in Mount Gramos are the only real undisturbed forests. Greek flora includes over 6,500 taxa, 22% of which are national or regional endemics, like this tree, the Cretan Zelkova, Yabelitsa, from which traditionally the shepherds in Crete made their walking staffs. And there are more than 500 tree species and woody species. In Greece, a lot of the surface area is protected under the Natura 2000 network, this European network of protected areas. Of the total terrestrial area in Greece, 41.5% are forests, However, it is important to note, and we are slightly lower than most of our European neighbors, and perhaps a little bit better off than Romania. What is important, though, is to keep in mind, don't look at all the numbers, but note that over 50% of species in forest ecosystems are in unfavorable condition. And the percentage is even higher for habitat types in forest ecosystems. So only 15% of them are in favorable condition. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that our forests and our species in the forest still are not safe. They have problems. Now let's look at the vegetation zones in Greece. And when we're talking about zones, don't think that there's a clear demarcation between them, one and the other. Then we can say, oh, here one stops and the other starts. Species extend into the different zones. The zones extend into each other. So it's mostly a description of vegetation characteristics combined with climatic characteristics that defines the vegetation zones. I will spend some time, probably more than the others, on this one, the first zone, which is called the EU Mediterranean zone, which is the most familiar, I guess, to us all, because it's the one that we see around the coastline, in the lower areas, the islands. It's characterized by evergreen sclerophyll shrubs and trees, low, usually spiny and aromatic shrubs, which can be deciduous or evergreen, geophytes that flower in the spring or autumn and die during the summer, and annual herbs that flower in the spring and then die. Here we will find some of the most recognizable trees, like the Aleppo pine, the Pefko, here seen in Attica in the Lavrion Mines archaeological site. The Turkish pine, the Thrakiotico Pefko, common, which replaces the Aleppo pine in northern Greece and some of the Aegean islands. The umbrella pine, Koukounarya, here in Skinia, with a very distinctive crown. The Kiparisi, the cypress, which, to give you an example of how the range of species extends, is common at sea level, but also extends up to the tops of the White Mountains in Crete. This is at an altitude of over 1,800 meters. Other trees like the carob tree, Haroupia, which was considered a very productive tree, which explains why in this picture the tree has been left in an otherwise cultivated part of the area. The tree was very important for its wood, but also for its fruit, from which can be used as animal feed, but also for the production of flour and also honey. And those two products, the flour and the honey, are making recently a comeback. They're becoming more and more popular now. The holm oak, the Aria, here seen over a 12th century old Byzantine church. And then the Purnari, the Kermes oak, quite common in central Greece, a favorite of the shepherds because they build their huts against it and use it as animal feed. It can reach tree size, as we see here, but usually it's grazed heavily by sheep and mostly goats, so it's kept in this form, lower standard shrubs. And of course, the iconic tree of Greece and the Mediterranean, the olive tree, the wild olive, which is the progenitor of the cultivated varieties. Within this zone, we have different plant communities, one of which is the Frigana, this community of low, mostly spiny shrubs, which is very similar to the South African fynbos or the chaparral of the Western United States. This includes a lot of orchid species, and also some of the most known species which are used for their aromatic and medicinal characters, such as the caper that we see here, the rock roses, and of course Rigani, Phascomyl or the sage, Thymari, Spanish thistle, the Ascolibros, which in Crete they make a mean arnaki with the Ascolibri. The next in size forest community is the Mediterranean maquis, which can be in shrub form, and where it's left undisturbed, mainly from grazing, it can reach tree form. And here we see a mixture of a lot of trees, wild olives, oriental maples. We see Haroupies, carob trees. We see Kutsoupies, Koumaries, which is the strawberry tree. So it's quite a big mixture in this plant community. And this is a typical scene that we see here. So we see forest, we see Frigana, we see shrub maquis, and then intermixed with them also cultivated areas, and in the distance urban settlements. This is a landscape from Attica. So it shows you the kind of mixtures that we have in the different zones. The plants in this zone are adapted to conserve water through strict control of evapotranspiration and loss of water from their leaves. The leaves are usually small, hard, dense, and thick. They have small openings, which are called stomata from the Greek word, and they're covered by hairs or waxes. They're very shiny, usually to reflect the sunlight, which is typical of the leaves of the wild olive, as we see here. The plants of this zone are also interconnected with fire. In a typical Mediterranean undisturbed habitat, forest fires would occur in a cycle of, let's say, between 40 to 70 years because of the accumulation of combustible material, which then burns, and then the cycle starts again. And some of the species are directly connected with the fire because otherwise they cannot germinate. Here we see the pine cones that have broken open to release the seeds. And if the species are left undisturbed, we have very quick, rapid natural regeneration. Here we see strawberry trees on Mount Parnitha. Just a few months after the fire of July 2007, we see in October, right after the first rains, they have started sprouting again. And we see the same thing here in Kythera after the fires. Again, with the first rain, the trees begin to sprout. The problem is that usually after the fires, we have grazing, which prevents regeneration, and we have illegal human activities, especially illegal building, which again preserves regeneration of the forest. Then the next zone is the para-Mediterranean zone. Here is the realm of oaks, Velanidies. As we see here, we have quite a few species in Greece. There are other deciduous trees mixed in with them. The Paulownia oak, Imeri velanidia, was once a very important species. It's very common as well. Most of Attica was covered with it. And now there are very few individuals like this magnificent specimen near Marathonas. And it was very important on the islands. The acorns were used for animal feed and in the tannery industry. Other trees like the Kouchoupia, the Judas tree, which I'm sure those of you that have visited the Greek countryside are familiar with, wild cherries, Agriokerassia, deciduous trees like the Balkan maple and ashes. This is a mixed forest with junipers. You can see the great variety. There's also the range of the chestnut trees, the sweet chestnut, Castagna, which is again a commercially important species for the production both of timber and honey as well as the fruit. And the particular specialty is the chestnut honey from the Ionoros, Mount Athos, the monastic community. Then we move up to the beech and montane conifer zone. Here we see beech trees, Oxies. Beech is a species that reaches to about halfway southwards down in central Greece. And the most common species in this part is the Greek fir, the elato, the kephalonitiko elato. Here we see it in the Peloponnese. And then as we move northwards, it's replaced by the Bulgarian fir, the Makedoniko elato, gradually replacing it, creating pure or mixed stems. And then we have the black pine, the Mavropevko, which is a very common species, extending in different areas, sometimes as far up as 1,500 meters and as low as a few hundred meters. Then we have the boreal conifer zone. Here we find some species that are not typical in Greece. They're restricted to the very northernmost parts, and especially in the Rhodope range. We have the Norway spruce, the Erythrelati, which forms a forest only in the area of Velatia in Drama. We have the silver birch, the Simida, which is found in a few places like Lake Mikri Prespa and then the Rhodope Mountains as well. The Scotch pine, the Dasopevko, a very important timber species, extending up to, let's say, the middle of Greece, in the area of Mount Olympus. Aspen, Tremusa levki, a beautiful tree in the autumn, which again is restricted to our northern mountains. And then, of course, the Balkanic endemic, the Bulgarian pine, the Robolo, which is the species that occurs at the highest altitudes in Greece, usually up to 2,300 meters, but on Mount Olympus reaching up to 2,600 meters. This is the tree that climbs the highest in our Greek mountains. Then above the tree line, we have the supraforest, the high altitude zone. We're not going to talk about that at all because it's mostly grasses. There are no trees here, but I should say that this is a very productive area. And this is where the flocks used to go. We see here an image from years ago that's in the mid-90s of Sarakatsani shepherds milking their flock in the traditional way. Then there's the azonal vegetation, is a term used for the mostly for riparian vegetation along waterways, usually, as we see here, small streams with willows, the platanos galleries, the plane tree galleries that we see along most of the Greek rivers and streams, and also some of the lowland alluvial forests. Very few of them are now left in the country. Forests of broadleaf species, they're maybe numbered in the fingers of one hand, I would say, remnants of once very extensive forests. And in this category, we also need to mention the Cretan date palm, Phoenicus, which is endemic to the Eastern Mediterranean. And the largest existing forest is in Vai in Crete, in Eastern Crete, the palm forest of Vai. And it's a strictly protected species, as you see here. The areas of transition between one zone and the other, which are scientifically called ecotones, as we see here in the forest of Fracto in the Rhodope Mountains, are very important for biodiversity, because this is where you find a mixture of species and a mixture of niches that support the high diversity of life. Forests are very important for hosting biodiversity because of their structural complexity. And what is important, again, as I mentioned before, is this mixture, this interchange of niches, of open areas, shrubs, trees. Then this creates much more favorable conditions for wildlife than this, which is essentially a monoculture. This is a natural forest, but also this is what we see in cultivated forests. So here, the species that we encounter are much fewer. And again, the interchange between open areas and forested parts is very important for animal species, because this is where the raptors will hunt, this is where the deer will come out to graze, this is where the small mammals will come out to feed, and this is where the wildflowers will appear. The dead wood is also very important because it contributes to the recycling of nutrients and to the creation and stability of soils. It stores carbon. It's a very important carbon sink. It provides food and shelter for fauna, increases the general productivity of the forest, and of course provide nesting cavities for a variety of species. As we see here with a roller bringing an insect to its nest. There are many plant species associated with the forest, some of which prefer the shade, the denser areas, like the Peloponnesian cyclamens that we see here, Tachyclamina, Croci, Crocus veluhensis in the area of Xanthi, carpeting the forest floor, Peonies. There are 7 different species in Greece, all associated with forests, shade-loving species. We have various orchids. This is a saprophytic orchid, which grows in very dark and humid areas. Many forest orchids, especially of the genera Epipactis and Cephalanthera. But also in the forest openings, we have a huge variety of plants. We spoke that we're talking about thousands of plants in Greece, like the Cretan Grecian foxglove, mullein, lilies, the red lily, the kokino crino, columbines, wild strawberries, Agriophraulis, which are delicious, bilberries, the myrtilla, Halles anemone, the poet's narcissus or narcissus, often found in small openings high up in the mountains. Marsh marigolds. This is an endemic, a very rare endemic of the Rhodope snowbell. Lots of mushrooms. We have about 3,000 different fungi in Greece. So all of them, or most of them, are found in forests, especially in the autumn when conditions are wet. A lot of insects, including many moths, and of course the Zizikia, the cicadas, which I'm sure that those of you that have been to Greece are familiar with. And we had a discussion a couple of days ago. They seem to be decreasing, as seems to be the trend for all insects in Europe. We're seeing a decline, which in some cases and for some genera and families reaches almost 80%. So this is a very alarming development as far as biodiversity is concerned. The common chameleon, is a denizen of trees in the island of Samos in the olive groves, and also the fire salamander. This is a rarely seen animal. Comes out only when it's very wet. You find it in wet areas in mountain forests. Many mammals, including the squirrel. This is the Greek version of the red squirrel, which is actually very dark, almost black. The large mammals, roe deer, the red deer, which is only found in the natural populations in the Rhodope Mountains, the brown bear, which is increasing its range in Greece in recent years due to the strict protection and the actions of a variety of NGOs. The jackal, again associated with dense cover. This is in the Nestos Delta, which holds the largest population. The wolf, here seen in the Evros area, leaving a feeding place where food is placed for the vultures. So wolves take advantage of that. And speaking of the vultures, some of the large raptors are associated directly with the forest, but not living in it, but rather nesting on the large trees, such as the black or cinereous vulture here seen in the forest of Dadia, where the only population survives. The golden eagle. Some of the smaller raptors, like the sparrowhawk, Toxefteri, and its larger relative, the goshawk. You can see the typical configuration of the true forest species, which have short rounded wings and a longish tail, so they can maneuver very quickly between the trees as they hunt for their prey, which mostly consists of birds, usually large to small birds. This is the kisa, the Eurasian jay, the common cuckoo, typical forest species, and along with the oriole, the psychophago, the two harbingers of spring in Greece with their very distinctive voices. Smaller birds like the finches, the chaffinch, and the hawfinch, a beautiful bird. The tits, a family of small, typically tree-living birds. We see here the different species that we have. The beautiful, very small blue tit, and the comical long-tailed tit. The tiny winter wren, Tripophractis. Nightingale, which is very rarely seen like that. This is a very cryptic species, usually found or heard actually in dense thickets and rarely coming out in the open like this. Species that live at the treetops, like the red crossbill, the Eurasian bullfinch. And also we should not forget the rich life in the riparian forest. Here we see the forest of Lake Erkini some years ago, and we'll talk about that later, which actually at that time hosted the largest colony of breeding wetland birds in Greece, with cormorants, the endangered pygmy cormorants, and a variety of heron species like the spoonbills here. Night predators, the owls, typical species is a long-eared owl, typical forest species. The Tengmalm's owl, rare species that reaches in Greece its southernmost limit of distribution, found in very few areas. The tawny owl, which is quite common all over the country. The pygmy owl, another rare species which is found only in the Rhodope range in the forest of Elatia. Here we see a mother feeding its 3 chicks. Typical forest birds like the hazel grouse, restricted to a specific type of coniferous forest. The same thing with the capercaillie. And some species that never come down from trees or branches, like the nuthatches. Here's the Eurasian nuthatch and the Cooper's nuthatch, which can be found only on Lesbos. It's an eastern species, mostly found in Asia Minor. The tree creepers, 2 species, actually very hard to distinguish between each other. And I think the most diagnostic feature is the length of their toes. And finally, the true species of the forest, the woodpeckers. Greece has 10 species of woodpeckers. The 3 spotted woodpeckers that we see here, the great, the middle, and the lesser. The black and white woodpeckers, larger, the Syrian, the white-backed, and the 3-toed, which is again a species that reaches its southernmost limit of distribution in the mountains of the Rhodope range. The green woodpeckers, actually one is the green and the other is the gray-headed. The larger one of all, the black woodpecker, which one might call as the architect of the forest, or because it digs a lot of holes in which at later stages other species will nest. And the smallest one of all, the wryneck, and this is the only one that migrates, that does not stay in Greece year-round. And since we've seen the amazing biodiversity harbored in our Greek forests, let's talk about the threats. The first being forest fires. I'm sure that most of you heard about the recent fire, which was just put under control a couple of days ago. It burned very near Athens, and it burned quite a large area, over 7,000 hectares, with loss of buildings. We had quite a few. We have every year quite a few fires. This is a picture taken in Mount Parnith after the fire there in 2007 that destroyed the unique fir forest. Just to give you some statistics, in the 20 years between 2000 and 2019, we had over 115 cases of fires, which totally burned about 800,000 hectares. And it's amazing to think that only 1% of them was responsible for 80% of the area that was burned. So this really means something, because if we can control those large fires, then we would reduce the amount of burned areas every year. So this is something that needs to be taken and is not really taken into account in our firefighting strategy. And just to give you some facts of what a really large fire can do, the wildfires of 2007 in the Peloponnese and the island of Evia resulted in 78 fatalities. 78 people lost their lives. More than 1,500 homes were destroyed. 270,000 hectares were burned, along with 1.5 million olive trees and over 60,000 domestic animals. So this is a huge loss, as you can see. This is a short video. It won't take long, but it shows you the number of fires as they occur through the year and where they occur. You will see as the pattern develops that the fires usually start in April or late April or May, and they gradually increase till about September, October, and then they reach a plateau again. And we also see here that the large fires are mostly, with few exceptions, concentrated in southern Greece. You see the chart lights up much more in the south. And we also begin to see a pattern that, with the exceptions of a few years, the number of wildfires per year is in the range of 20, 30, 40. We have, of course, the exceptions, like 2012, when we had almost 100 fires. But you can see that there is a repetition as far as the time, the frequency. So these are important elements that need to be taken into account in planning the firefighting strategy in Greece. This is a picture taken from USIT. It's from the recent fire, and I'm bringing this up to discuss a few things. First of all, one of the problems that increases the damage that we see from wildfires recently is what has been happening for decades in Greece, which is the illegal building. Most of those settlements that were recently burned, like what happened now in Megara, or 3 years ago in Mati, started out as holiday homes, which were illegally built in forest areas, and then they were subsequently legalized by the governments in exchange of either votes or money. So essentially, those settlements were not planned. They were created haphazardly, without really any kind of zoning, without proper roads, without proper escape routes, and without consideration of what might happen in the fire. So essentially, we have urban settlements encroaching and mixing with the forest. And then, of course, when something happens, homes are destroyed, properties are lost, and we start thinking about who to blame, which is usually the government, not without reason. But I think the problem starts with the people. So this is something that has contributed to the destructive effects of many of the fires in recent years. Another thing that needs to be taken into account is that in 1998, the responsibility of fighting forest fires was taken from the Forestry Service, which was responsible at that time, and was given to the Hellenic Fire Service in the thinking that it would be a unified approach to fire prevention and firefighting, which actually does not really work, because what we have seen, and which has been proven by studies, is that the fire service does not have the intimate knowledge that the Forestry Service has of the areas, and it does not have the means and the people to actually fight the fire in the forest. So what happens is they create a perimeter, they try to protect the settlements, the houses, the property, the people, but they don't so much try to protect the forests. So we see fewer and fewer fire breaks in the forest, and with the abandonment of many of the activities in the forest, such as logging, which cleaned up some areas, and the overall reduction in personnel and in funding for the Forestry Service that we have seen since that time in the last 20 years, which essentially has made it much less functional and effective. We see an escalation in the damage and the results of the forest fires. And what we have after the fires is increased erosion, of course, because once the trees are gone, the soil becomes vulnerable to wind and mainly water. So we have landslides and subsidence. Some of you will know or will remember the floods that we had in Mandra a couple of years ago with loss of human life, which came as a result of increased precipitation, but after fires had burned the trees on the mountains above the town. And again, it's easy to think about it afterwards, but this has to be taken into account into all our planning. So it's not just fighting the fires, it's making sure about the eventualities that will follow a fire. And of course, we have a lot of transfer of sediment and debris to the sea, which also in areas such as Megara, where the last fire was, will create problems in the sea as well. And what we have to keep in mind is that the way the conditions are going and the climate is changing with the acceleration of the climatic crisis, we should expect things to become worse. In the last 20 years, we have seen average temperatures getting higher and higher. They've been the highest in the last 500 years. And actually, the last 10 years have been the hottest ever, with 2020 being the hottest ever year in Europe and tied with 2016 globally. So all we can expect is a worsening condition. Another problem for forests is the inability to balance conflicting needs. And this is mostly relevant for riparian woodlands. We'll give you the example of the forest of Lake Akini that I talked about earlier. Lake Akini is an artificial lake north of Thessaloniki, which created by a dam actually in the mid-20s, but the dam was rebuilt in 1982. In this picture, the dam is in the far left corner of the lake. And there was a very large area of forests at the time, which was, of course, flooded when the lake, the water level was high in the lake. Actually, here we have conflicting interests, because on one hand, we have the use of water for irrigation, which needs a high water level. And then on the other hand, we have flood control, which requires a low water level. And we also have the requirements for biodiversity, which also requires a low water level. And also that the increase is not rapid, but is very gradual, so that the natural regeneration is allowed. This did not happen. So over the years, from 1982, when the forest covered, already reduced, but covered about 700 hectares. Sorry. Yeah, there's a mistake here. This should have been around 1990. It was already down in 10 years. It was already down to 350 hectares. And if we look at the perimeter of the forest at that time, this is when this picture was taken in 1992. 2000, it was already down to 200 hectares. And if we look at the recent superimposed image from Google Maps, this is the perimeter of the forest. It's less than 10 hectares now. You see that it's about 1% of the original area of the forest, and which at this moment is mostly solitary trees or stands of a few trees. So essentially, we're not talking about a forest anymore. And with this comes a loss of the rich biodiversity that the forest supported. All those species that were nesting in the trees are now gone. And the populations have decreased dramatically. Another problem is competition with invasive species, which studies have shown that they grow and they spread faster. They actually have been shown to migrate altitudinally at twice the speed of native species because they're already genetically prepared for quick spread. This is an example from the Nestos Delta, where HSPN is implementing another project. Here we have what you see as the lighter zone next to the trees in the back of the grasses is an invasive tree, Amorpha fruticosa. This was taken 3 years ago, and then next year, although this is not directly comparable, it's the same place, you can see the spread of this invasive tree. And in our recent visit, I did not go, but I had information from staff of HSPN that were working there, is that there's literally no open grassy area left anymore. It's just shrubs and trees of Amorpha fruticosa. It's a very difficult species to control, very hard. It's a worldwide pest, and unfortunately, no really effective method has been found so far. And before we go on to the climate change situation, let me just backtrack to forest fires and mention that HSPN is implementing a big project in the island of Kythira, involving the local communities and especially scientists. And this has to do with fire prevention and fire protection, involving the local communities there, the villages where we created maps so that there's good knowledge of where the combustible areas are, which areas of the villages may be at risk, what routes people would have to take out to escape a fire if that happens. So this is a very innovative project. It's just finishing now, and we're hoping that the ministry will accept the results, because we're already in discussion, so that they will be transferred to and applied to other areas in Greece as well. And coming to climate change, one of the problems is that edge populations, as we call them, the populations that reach the limits of distribution, will go extinct as conditions change. Species that have small, fragmented, localized, and isolated populations, so there's no exchange between them, will most likely disappear. This is an orchid, Gymnadenia relicani, which occurs only on Mount Falakro, and the next closest population is in Bulgaria, a couple of mountains away. So you can understand that such a population of a few dozens or hundreds individuals is very susceptible to outside pressures of all sorts, be it biotic or abiotic. Another thing is that species are migrating already. We see them moving higher up on the mountains or moving northwards. And many native species have already moved their distributions. So we've seen that with oaks, we've seen that with quite a few species in the southern European countries. There are some very good studies out of Spain. Many species, apologize for the spelling mistake here, may not be able to match the speed of the climate changes, so they eventually will become extinct. And also the changes in forest composition will affect biodiversity in the long run. And also what is happening is the fragmentation and changes in land use through cultivation or cutting down of forests hinder the migration of plant species. Then we have increased damage because of extreme weather events associated with climate change. Here we see extensive damage around Lailias in Ceres because of high winds and snow. And also there's increased susceptibility to pathogens and invasions of pests. This is a tumor caused by a bacterium. You see here in the picture. A very interesting example, this is Ips typographus, is a beetle that burrows under the bark of conifer trees. And this species has adjusted its lifestyle, made it shorter because of the improved warmth and warmer conditions. And this results in increased generations per year. And now it has affected large areas of boreal forests all over Europe. This is maybe some of you will have heard about the damage in the famous forest of Białowieża in Poland. This is the species beetle that is responsible, and it's affected about 90% of the fir trees in that forest. And here are the larvae in the wood. We see here, again, in the forest of Elatia, a selective infestation of pines by another bark-eating beetle, which eventually leads to necrosis, and then the trees will break or fall down under the weight of snow or through the wind. And we also have expansion of other pests. This is the caterpillar of Limandria dispa. It's a butterfly, but the caterpillar is a pest to oak trees. You can see here it's munching on an oak leaf, and this is its growth and expansion is to a great degree responsible for the decline of oak forests in many areas of Central Europe. And in the Mediterranean basin, we have the Thamatopea pitiocampa. This is, I think, a very familiar caterpillar to those of you that have been in the Greek forests. And we have seen that in recent years, it expands its distribution to greater altitudes. Here we see the characteristic cocoons. I'm sure most of you, or those of you that have been here, will be familiar with the cocoons on the pine trees. And here we see them even at altitude of 1,500 meters on Mount Falakro. So as you see, there are quite a few dangers that are threatening our Greek forests. And it will take an effort to address the environmental crisis that we have here, a crisis that is not only climatic, but it also affects biodiversity in many ways. And actually, those two elements, the climate and biodiversity, are interrelated and interconnected, and they affect each other to a great degree. And with this, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nikos, for that very interesting presentation. Greece's biodiversity is incredible, and we're very happy to see that HSPN is doing so much with the projects in Kythera to protect Greece's biodiversity and nature. We do have a question that came through from Thanasios Milousis, who has asked, where do we stand today with the reforestation initiative launched by the Greek government in 2020? Are you aware of the...
There's another question as well regarding the decline of insects.
Yes, yes. Did you want to address?
Yes, I'll take both. As far as the reforestation, this was announced a few months ago, and actually it was supposed to be the subject of a broad discussion, including a lot of civil society actors, NGOs, and all that. There was some discussion, as we have seen in recent years. Actually, the public consultation is neither long nor very effective, but the way it's applied. At the moment, we have no clear picture of what is happening. There may be plans at the ministry, but they have not been announced yet. There are also plans with the recovery fund, which of course will bring a lot of money into Greece. We know that the plans have been submitted to the European Union. We're expecting their final approval, but we really have no specific idea of what has been suggested. So funds from that area would be diverted to reforestation as well, or forest protection, forest fighting, biodiversity protection. So it is expected, and we have heard the words, but we have seen nothing concrete yet. And the problem is that we do not, again, the public consultation on that was minimal, just very broad ideas. And we have seen to date no specific facts or action plans or ways to move forward with that. So we really don't know exactly where we are. Regarding the second question, we have a global loss of insects and biodiversity. And this will, of course, the first thing that it will affect is pollination, because insects are the main pollinators on the planet. So we should be expecting to see a decline in plant species. There will probably effects on crops, on food security, products that come directly from nature, so, wild herbs and plants like that. So this is quite alarming, and it is a subject of interest, by the big international organizations. So this is it arises from a combination of factors that have to do with climate change, with the extensive use of agrochemicals, pesticides, fertilizers, also the changes in land uses. So it's quite a complex situation, but we do expect that it will create problems.
I had a question actually. Are any of Greece's forests protected by UNESCO? And does that improve, or do they have projects to protect Greece's forests?
There are not specifically as forests. I mean, Mount Olympus is a biosphere heritage area. So in that sense, there is some protection. Actually, the main protection is, first of all, national laws. But there are laws protecting forests, and there are laws directing that the burnt areas are automatically protected, and they should be either left to regenerate naturally or be reforested. So the laws are there. It's the implementation that's lacking. So the problems that we see with all the illegal activities are not because we don't have the laws, it's because they're not implemented. The other thing, as far as protection, is the European network of protected areas, Natura 2000, which includes all the member countries of the European Union, and the conditions and the legislation concerning the Natura 2000 areas has been incorporated into national law by all the member states in Europe. So we all follow the same regulation and rules. There's a bit of leeway for the member countries as far as designating protected areas, but once they're designated, the protection should apply in the same manner throughout Europe. The coverage is quite good in Greece. I would say that it's probably above the European average. And as far as forests are concerned, a lot of them are included. Again, the problem is that if we look at the requirements, we're about, I would say, 10 to 12 years behind our goals. So things as like the assessment studies, the management studies, the final designation of areas with presidential decrees, all those are lagging behind, sometimes with no obviously good or understandable reason. So again, we come to a point of poor implementation of the laws that exist.
Right. You mentioned in your presentation that statistics show that undisturbed forests make up only, was it 1-2% in the EU?
In the EU.
How do we, or what's being done to protect those undisturbed forests, and are they under threat also from things like climate change and human destruction?
Human destruction, not so much, because most of those pristine areas are protected. For example, the boreal forests on the borders of Finland with Russia, or in the far northern Norway, where most of them occur in Scandinavia, and some of the areas in Central Europe, like the Black Forest in Germany, the Schwarzwald. So as far as protection goes, I think there is enough there. Now, if we're talking about climate change, that's a completely different picture, because if you think that 2 years ago we had huge forest fires in Sweden, which was an unknown condition in that country, there might be a small fire, but we had huge fires because of prolonged dry weather, which is completely unusual. So I think if we factor in climate change, we will begin to see problems with those areas as well.
Right. And there was another statistic that said 42% of the total area in the EU are semi-natural. Is that right?
That's forest area, but that includes everything. So that's 100%, out of which 2% is the undisturbed original forest, plantations, and the managed. In Europe, at least Central and Northern Europe, and even in Greece, most of the forests are in some way managed, either for timber, for wood products. For example, until some decades ago, a big area of production in forests was resin, pine resin. So the forests were managed to collect the resin. So of course, some of these activities have gradually faded out, but still the practices of managing the forests, clearing up the undergrowth, cutting roads and things like that are in effect. And I would say in Greece that one of the problems that we have seen until very recently is that management was only for production, be that wood or firewood or whatever. It did not take into account the holistic approach and what the role that the forest can play for biodiversity. For example, when they were logging an area, it was a clear cut. The crews went in and they removed everything. Instead, what should happen, and what happens in most European countries, is that they selectively leave some of the old trees, which provide the nest for the woodpeckers, which provide the food for the insects. So there's a pre-selection, and that you leave some of the species or the trees standing there. So we have rather poor management until, I would say, the last 10, 15 years ago, but this is gradually changing as far as management goes. The problem in Greece now is that in the last 20 years, we also have seen a significant decline in the effectiveness of the forestry service. So it's been losing its effectiveness more and more because it gets less funds, it's understaffed, it does not have quality personnel. Old people that were very experienced retire and then they move on and they're not replaced. So for example, there have been many cases where we needed something done or we had a complaint and we said, no, it's impossible, we can't go there because we don't have fuel. Right. So basic things like that. So the forestry service has quite a few problems at the moment in Greece.
It was interesting to see just going back to that point that you said that forests are complex structures and that wildlife need them to be complex and that they don't thrive as much in a monoculture. Mm-hmm. So I think it's good that Greece is learning about management and trying to maintain that complexity.
I see a couple of questions from Alexander here talking about mushrooms and truffle hunting. Well, yes, that has become actually quite big in recent years, and there are some areas in Greece, for example, Grevena in West Macedonia, which have created a local, allow me to call it industry, or at least an activity there which centers on mushrooms. They organize excursions, they bring people there for mushroom testing, tasting. So there are activities sort of like ecotouristic activities focused on mushrooms. So that is happening. And as far as the other question, I think has to do with youth. HSPN actually is very heavily involved in that because I don't know if probably mentioned those in my previous presentation. We are implementing environmental education programs since 1992. So we have 5 programs running throughout Greece at the moment, 3 of which are global programs, which we implement in Greece as a member of the Foundation for Environmental Education that runs them in other countries. 2 are national, and actually one of the international programs is called Learning About Forests. So this is focused specifically on that, and on a global scale, there are 26 countries participating in the program. At the moment, we have about 1 million students worldwide. So that's quite a number. I have the facts handy because I'm part of the board of directors of the Foundation for Environmental Education. I'm responsible for LEAF. And today we had our annual operators meeting. So yes, there are efforts to educate youth and especially the younger ages. And we see a change of attitude. Gradually, the younger people are getting more and more involved, although maybe not in the traditional ways, but there's a lot of activity. For example, when Mount Parnitha burned back in 2007, there was one of the largest demonstrations in Athens, including political rallies and all that, which was completely spontaneous. The people actually protested or marched because the forest was burned. Unfortunately, not much came out of that, but at least there was a sign that people do care. And that's a problem again with reforesting. For example, on Mount Parnitha, what was burned at the time was mostly fir forest, which is very difficult to regenerate. That's because it needs conditions like what I described. It needs a forerunner species that will create the conditions for the fir seeds to grow And this is not easy to do artificially. So if there's not enough left for natural regeneration, it will not happen. So the effort, there have been attempts, but more than 10 years down the line, we haven't really seen any regeneration from the plantings. Whatever is happening in the stands of the original fir forests that were left unburned at the time.
Okay. Do we have any more questions there? I don't see any more questions. I was actually, you were mentioning the statistics about the 2007 fires, and I was actually in Peloponneso in Sparti, and I was coming back. My family had taken me to see Monemvasia, and on the way home, we could see Taietos burning. It was just the start, and it was terrible. So whatever we can do to obviously support HSPN, or if anyone watching wants to try and participate in the mentorship program, you can do that also if you're interested in this topic about reforestation, climate change, and those issues. Did you have any other comments, Nikos, or anything else you wanted to add? It was a wonderful presentation.
Well, it's a very big subject, so we can talk about it for days if we want. But I think we've covered enough for now. So
well,
food for thought.
You'll join us again in the fall for another webinar, and I hope everybody watching can join us again. In the meantime, you can also visit HSPN's website. I think we'll put it up just before we end the webinar, and you can learn about the many wonderful environmental projects and initiatives. And Nikos' photographic works can also be found in many of his books, in particular the recent book on biodiversity titled Greece, the Land of Diversity. And the new leaders will continue to work closely with Nikos and HSPN. So please feel free to contact us to learn more about the mentorship program, or if you're interested in becoming involved with the new leaders or THI Canada, please visit our website and sign up. And the link, we will share the link now to the THI Canada New Leaders webpage and HSPN. There it is. So thank you everybody for being a part of the New Leaders in HSPN's webinar today, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos.
Thank you, Natalie, for the invitation, and Natasha, and I'm sure we'll do that again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Have a great day all. Bye.
Bye.